how were your kids during it all? And did they see you guys become friends? Was that...
Yes, they saw us probably both at our worst. And they did see us become friends. In fact, I think my one daughter said to her sister, when she heard us having this civil conversation, "Can you believe that? Like, listen, they're actually having a civil conversation."
Welcome back to another episode of What Matters Most. We're here with Diana Melnyk. Diana, could you just let us know a little bit about yourself, and maybe we'll talk a bit about why you're here?
I came to Red Deer 24 years ago this month, and took a band teaching job here. I needed to support myself because my then husband had asked for a divorce. And so I came to Red Deer and took a band teaching job. And then I became an elementary music teacher and met my current husband of 23 years and going on 24. And I've been here ever since 2000.
So yeah, I had no idea you were a band teacher. I think I just learned something. That's so cool. One of the reasons why we decided to ask you here was because, well, this podcast is about what matters most. And I remember we were chatting about a year and some ago, and you mentioned some of the things that you went through, and they stayed with me for a really long time. And so I thought when this podcast came up, I had this feeling that I kept needing to ask you to be on this podcast, because I feel like you have things that people need to hear. You have experiences that people need to hear. And so I know many times you're like, I don't know how I got here, but maybe there are some things and principles that you've implemented into your life that maybe could help people. Maybe one thing that I think would be really important is how you were able to let go of those hard times and move forward. So I think what we want to do is talk about first how hard it was for you. I remember you telling me some pretty crazy things. So I guess let's get right into it.
Well, it hadn't been a very happy marriage anyway. There were lots of times I wanted to leave, but I had 3 children in 3 years due to ruptured appendix before I got married. And so there were infertility issues. And so I finally had my 3 children in 3 years and thought, well, where would I go with 3 little ones? So you just stay and you make the best of things. And there were good times, that kind of counterbalance the bad, but as time passed, it seemed like there was more bad. And so actually he asked me for a divorce, and it was a relief because I didn't have the courage to ask him for a divorce. So then, reality hits you. Okay, how am I going to provide for myself? What am I going to do? And I had been a band teacher, and so I got a phone call on a blocked number, on a number that wasn't public, and it was someone from Red Deer asking me, could I come interview for a band job? So I came to Red Deer and I interviewed, and they convinced me to take the job. And I had just finished a house in my little town, and the kids were there and they had their friends, and so it was really tough to leave. And he didn't want me to leave. And when he got wind that I was doing this, screeched up to my front door and screamed and yelled, and the neighbors had to call the police. And anyway, but I came to Red Deer, and he continued to, to phone and be abusive on the phone, and yeah, it was a really hard time, and I think probably maybe what helped me get through it was my kids, and the love we had, and they were a little bit afraid of their dad, so they wanted to be with me, and then I met a really nice man here in Red Deer at church, and we married quite quickly, probably too quickly in hindsight, but yeah, we're still together.
That's good. So there are some things did you ever feel like during those hard times, you can talk a little bit more about that if you want, but during those hard times, did you feel like, how did we get here? One, will this ever end? And how can I move forward? How can I forgive?
Yeah.
Those are all those.
Yeah, in the midst of it, when all the ugliness was happening, and he was being, abusive, not physically, but emotionally, and trying to take the kids away. Yeah, how do you, there were lots of hard times. He would call and say really mean, rude things to my new husband, and he would tell the kids bad things about me and tell lies, and yeah, just wouldn't leave us alone for quite a long time, quite a few years. One time he brought back the kids, one of the daughters, to my house, and the other daughter was in the doorway, and I went out to the car to say something, and as I walked back around the front of the car, he slammed on the gas and then screeched to a halt just as he hit my hip. And I called the police, and they just said, "Oh, well, he said he wanted you to be hit, and so it's your word against his." And of course, they did nothing. So
Wow.
even though my daughter saw the whole thing,
Yeah.
there was just incidences like that were really uncalled for, but were really unsettling. But I thought we would never be friends. I wanted nothing to do with him. It was just so negative. And yeah, I thought we would never be in a place where I would want to talk to him and that we could possibly be friends. Mm-hmm. But somehow we got there.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, really.
You did mention there was actually kind of a turning point.
I think there was, I guess the turning point would be, and this was probably at least 8 years in to the divorce and into my new marriage. And I had serious surgery and was home recovering. And I wasn't taking his calls, and the phone rang, and I didn't check the caller ID. I answered the phone, and it was him. And I think somehow maybe that just broke the ice a little. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how. And I remember back in the early days of our divorce that our pastor said, "Oh, one day you'll be able to forgive him." And I just thought, are you kidding?
Yeah.
I will never forgive him.
Yeah.
But it seemed after that day that I answered the phone, we talked for a bit. It was strained, but it was the first time we'd probably talked in years. And I don't know, just maybe from there, maybe both of us softened a bit. I think maybe I had always tried to, I'd make soup and send with the kids and homemade buns when they go be with their dad. Mm-hmm. And I tried to be kind and do those things and not be bitter. But I think he was really bitter, and I think he was upset with himself for the choices he made. I think in the end he had regrets that he wasn't still with me and the children. And and I couldn't change that. I mean, that was his choice. He made it. Mm-hmm. But I think enough time had passed that perhaps he saw that I was happily married and I wasn't crazy.
Yeah.
And I had a new husband who was content with me, and my kids were happy. And so perhaps that helped soften him a bit. It just seemed like after that, he would call once in a while, and then he would call more frequently. And he's passed away now, it'll be 2 years this July. But I think in the end, he, the last few years, he would call often about decisions he was making, and we'd always talk about the kids and where they were at and what they needed and what they were doing. And he was much more hands-on with our children then than he was when they were young.
Yeah.
And
You think time healed?
I think time and distance between, away from the garbage and the nastiness, I think, because, you can only be nasty so long. I mean, maybe people can carry it on, but he didn't, and I never really went there. I mean, of course it takes two, but I just didn't want to have anything to do with them because it was so hurtful how he acted. But, as time passed, it was a little bit safer to, you have to feel safe, I guess, to be vulnerable again, because you're vulnerable if you let them in again. So, yeah.
So I feel like, in our instances, like we've all been through divorce here, but I feel like one of the key things that I've learned is that forgiveness has to happen with boundaries.
Oh, for sure.
Like,
yeah.
I think I was listening to Brene Brown.
Oh, yeah.
One night, and I was 5 years into being a single mom. And she talked about kindness is not kindness without boundaries. And compassion is not compassion without boundaries. And it was just that, light bulb moment that I realized, okay, letting somebody walk all over you and do whatever they please so you can keep the peace is not being kind. What? And so I just okay. So that's how I learned that, this is how I'm going to move forward. Do you feel like that you maybe subconsciously or didn't intend, but as you set boundaries, that was how you progressed?
I think I consciously set boundaries.
Okay.
I think with him, there had to be boundaries, or he would push the boundaries. And so there had to be boundaries to a certain degree where I would have to, first of all, I think you have to respect yourself and have those boundaries to protect yourself. But I think respecting yourself and not being a pushover or a doormat. And,
that's right.
And just saying, this, I can let you in this far into my life again, but with boundaries. That, you're not going to take advantage of my kindness or the kids. Make wedges between them and yourself and I.
Yeah.
And so I think it's possible to forgive and to be, a friend again, but for sure with boundaries.
Yeah.
And depending who you're dealing with, but certain people you have to have boundaries with.
Yeah.
They'll take advantage of you.
That's right.
And depending who you are too, if you're too easy or soft or kind, then you could easily be taken advantage of.
Totally. I think I've learned that the hard way on many occasions, but I'm glad I've learned it.
Yeah.
And I think I keep learning it. I don't think you suddenly, I'm going to do it. I think it's a process.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, especially with people who were once really close to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
I think that's the hardest part is when someone is when you come back out of a marriage, right? It is somebody that you are close to, or obviously at some point there's you loved each other enough to get married, but it comes to a certain point where it gets bad enough that you need to have a divorce, or you separate, and then it changes, right? And that person is wow, it's different. This is a different person. And it's well, how do I navigate this? How do I deal with that? Because it's not just you're navigating through it of this is just a person, and you have to sometimes you're dealing with the emotions attached with that, because there's this grief that goes along with it.
Oh, for sure.
Just because this person is no, there's hurt. There's hurt on both ends, right? Just because you're tearing it apart. It doesn't just happen without some pain, and then there's anger, and everybody deals with it differently, and then you have the outbursts of emotions and whatever, and that hurts too. And so there's all these things that And it's like everything's just spilled over. Here you are. Now you got to pick up the pieces or some way, like, because whether you move on together or whether you move on separate, there's still reconciliation that has to happen.
Yeah.
At some point.
And so you have to like deal with that.
Yeah.
And I think I like how you guys are talking about time. I think that's the biggest thing. Distance helps too.
Yeah.
But when I was thinking as you were talking, like I've dealt with it on like kind of two perspectives. My parents divorced when I was younger, and then I went through divorce myself. As I watched my parents go through a divorce, I feel like I was, you know, I was sort of witnessing that. Like, how is this ever going to, like, you know, get to the point where they like
resolve,
just like really, you know, bitter towards one another. I remember at my college graduation, they wouldn't sit at the same table, and I had to, like, you know, tell the organizer, like, I can't have my parents sit at the same table because it's not like it's not cohesive to, or it's not conducive to that, you know, and so you like you have to have like this, like, you know, it's really hard as a child to deal with that. But as I've seen them move through the years, it gives me hope. Going through my own divorce, like, you know, like that there's actually, because like we actually had a family event this weekend, and my parents, they're both getting married. They're chatting with their new spouse, like with their spouses, like, just like friends, and there's, you know, it's just no problems, and it was like, wow. It was so there's that huge contrast, like, you know, like what 20 years ago or whatever, like 20 some years ago. I can't even like remember how
time is really awesome,
right? Yeah. But yeah, it takes that time, but but now it's like it's amazing how sometimes you can bridge that. I mean, if you let it, right? Like, I mean, I think there's those that don't.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's those that don't.
I had someone tell me that getting a divorce was like a death.
It is.
Only the person didn't die. They're still in your life, causing you whatever they're causing, what they used to cause, right? They're still there.
Yeah.
And I think for people who are getting a divorce, at first I didn't think of it was like a death. I just know I was hurting.
Yeah.
And on some levels I was relieved, but I think you go through the stages of grief. You know, you're angry and you're hurt and you're in denial and there's all these different things you go through. And I think that's why time is so important, because you do have to process all these different feelings, and it takes time to go through all that, for sure.
It takes time to go through that. I love that, because it does.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, like everybody deals with it differently. And I think I've learned that with my divorce too, is that, you know, I have to allow that other person to deal with it the way he needs to deal with it. And you have, likewise with your ex-wife and with your ex-husband, you just have to allow it. And if, you know, you can only control what you can control.
Exactly. You can't control the other person and how they're reacting and responding. You can only control yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you mentioned the boundaries and the way that, you know, they might react to that differently, and but you can't let that stop you from the, you know, sticking to your decisions and being able to forgive at your level, right? Because it's like, no, well, this is what I'm comfortable with, you know, but it's I think so important to keep that perspective of time, because it's like, if you're just like focused on the here and now, those reactions are going to be like, oh no, it's not working. Like, why can't this like actually like work out? Like, we deal with like lots of things like that all the time. That's because we're in the middle of it.
Yeah. I think another thing with boundaries is really good is that I feel like boundaries gives you the space to forgive. Like, when I was in the middle of it, like newly in the middle of it, I'm still in the middle of it, but when I was newly a single mom, there were just things after things after things after things, because the other person was hurting. And I would have to deal with those things, and they just wouldn't stop. And so trying to forgive was kind of impossible. It was impossible because it was constantly happening still. And so once I learned that I needed to set boundaries, wow, that gave me the space for grace.
Yeah.
And I was able to process those things on my own rather than having that voice, my ex-husband's voice in my head all the time, hurting and hurting and hurting. So, that was a big thing. Like, I know that some people are going through this that are watching, but just know that boundaries really are important. They're important for the other person because it sends a message. This is what is appropriate for me, and this is what's not. But also, it gives you that space for grace, to move forward.
We talked about the turning point, but like, I mean, that's not all that, because like, how did you get to the point, like, to overcome the emotions, to be able to love, to be able to, I guess, have that forgiveness come into you, and then, like, be able to,
I think in a lot of ways, and this might seem foreign to some of you, I think my faith and my belief in that I have a Heavenly Father and that I have a Savior in Jesus Christ, and I try to think like that, to pattern my life like that. And I think of, as I study and learn more about the Savior Jesus Christ, I think of what He did for us and how He is forgiving of us, and we have to forgive others. And I think through that process of trying to pattern my life after Jesus, and knowing what we learn in the Bible, and that we have to love one another and forgive. And so I think that at some point played a role in my ability to forgive, but it's certainly not something that comes instant and without effort, and I think by setting boundaries, I was able to then control His influence in my life and my children's life. And setting those boundaries was able to provide me with a level of safety, perhaps, and comfort, a comfort level that, and then I could feel like I was in control in my own life. And if what was happening with him, I wouldn't allow that to come in and affect me so much. I would just remind myself that he made a choice, and he's having to live with the consequences. Right. And I could let him in to ask how the kids are, be a friend, how's it going? And he could call me and bounce off, I'm thinking of doing this, or, talk about the kids and where they were at. And those were the boundaries that I allowed, to have those discussions.
When you started setting those boundaries, how did he react?
Well, I think at first he was surprised that I would stand up for myself. Yeah. That wasn't my norm. Yeah. And it's usually the doormat that go along with everything and just to make peace. Yeah. But so I think there was probably pushback, if I recall. That, my goodness, like, she can't do that. How could she do that? But at some point, there's acceptance.
That gives me hope that there's acceptance, and not just for my own situation, but for people probably that are listening, where they're scared to set boundaries because they're afraid of the reaction, that at some point there is acceptance, and that those boundaries can then create a better relationship.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, it's incumbent upon the other person to accept those boundaries, and we don't always know how they're going to react or respond. True. But that's on them.
That is on them.
That's on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in your case, it was acceptance.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
I can definitely relate to what you're talking about with, with your faith being a huge part of it. And I think that's like what you're describing is that healing in your own mind. Like you have like, I can think, in my situation, going through the separation, the divorce, and like, the thing, like the things that we're dealing with, I had like so much emotions, like out of my control. And if I didn't have my faith, like if I didn't have a God to pray to, and like, I understand that everyone's at different levels or different beliefs, but there's still like other outlets and other ways. But like for me, that was my, being able to have someone to like look to. And then knowing that I just couldn't do it on my own. I mean, there was, of course, like people to reach out to and, like, and whatever, but in regards to that, that forgiveness, because there's like, again, that hurt that I was talking about, like, because of the things that happen in the events or that go around it, and just coming around, like, emotions, like I'd never felt anger like I had. And it was like, I needed to be able to feel peace.
And I think divorce brings out the very worst in all of us. We don't think, oh, wow, am I really this person?
Yeah.
When you're going through it, and then with time, you realize, oh, that's not who I want to be. That's not who I really am, but it's because I'm dealing with all these emotions.
Right.
And the hurt and the anger, and it takes time to heal, to work through and find a peace again.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thought, because if you think that way and you're like, this is not the person that I am, it's just because I'm dealing with all of these things, maybe at some level we could think that about our ex.
Yeah.
And that might be a paradigm shift to changing, like, that relationship in, or where it's at the point, at that negative point. Yeah.
I think a lot of times when we're in the marriage, we have such focus on the kids, like doing things for the kids, and then in a divorce situation, that can shift, and sometimes we forget that we still need to be there for the kids, and we still need a co-parent. And so it's like, if you had that same attitude, like, can we just be civil for the kids? Can we just maybe we still have these emotions, but can we just do it for like a few hours while we're there for our kids' recital or whatever we're there for, right? Like, just be there for that. And then, and then we, like, I've done it. I've had to like do that. And then, oh man, and you come home and it's a release, and you just like, man, it was really hard, but you do it for the kids. Same as in the marriage, right?
Yeah.
It's really important. I think kids are the victims. They are.
Yeah, they are.
And they never asked for it. And sometimes they take on a lot that we don't realize.
And they don't really rarely understand what
really understand
our adult issues were.
Yeah.
And they often blame themselves.
That's right.
Gee, Mom doesn't love Dad anymore. Could she still love me? Dad doesn't love Mom anymore. Like, where does that leave me?
Right.
Or like, Dad left or Mom left, will the other parent leave too? Those are heartbreaking thoughts that kids go through. And so to really like focus on the kids, and realize that, this was not their fault. We need to make sure that they know that. I think that can be a unifying purpose in divorce, if both parents are willing to focus on that. But it's not always the case. But again, we can only control what we can control. And if you focus on your children and swallow some of the infuriating unfairness and try and be there, that will always benefit the children.
Yeah.
I think if you, like, you're just like, infuriating in fairness. Sometimes we can be so like stuck on that, right? Like, oh, you did this, or you did that. And it's like, well, because I've gotten like stuck in that game where it's like where you can have like just kind of yelling matches with your ex, and it's like, do you feel better after it?
Yeah.
Like, not at all. Like,
No, it feels worse.
It's like, well, maybe I got this off my chest, but like it doesn't help.
It does not. It does not.
It's sometimes it's better to just like leave things unsaid and just deal with it. Like, you know what? Like, you're not with that person anymore. So it's like, what does it do any good to like fight like, oh, you did this to me, and just so that they know, like, well, maybe they, like, they can figure that out on their own, and that like doesn't always help, especially if you're wanting to get to a point where you can just be civil.
That's something that I had to realize too. Like, when you talk about, this is not me moments, this is because I'm hurting, I had to set boundaries because I could not put myself in the situations where I would be, because the emotions were so high, that I would be losing my cool. So I set those boundaries, like, we only text and email, because I just can't, because it's still, after a long period of time, it's still emotional.
Rise.
Yes, it's still emotional, and it's been years. So for me, that's my boundary, but we're able to be civil enough through texting and emailing, and I don't put myself in that position where I lose my cool or I have the emotions, and then I feel worse after. So I think it's important to know where your boundary is.
Know your triggers. What's going to trigger you, and so that maybe help set boundaries.
Yeah. I think it's so important.
Yeah, I think for me too, it's like sometimes I dealt with it as like, this is like more of a business conversation.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a business conversation. We're talking about the kids.
Keep the emotion out of it, right?
Emotions are out.
Yeah.
That's what they actually tell you to do.
Yeah.
We're talking business. This is a business relationship. Yeah. We're co-parenting.
Yeah. So then it just remains a little short.
Yeah.
I don't have to like,
No.
because just avoids any of that little extra things you might say that might like get the other person upset, or just like, not that it doesn't happen. Sometimes it, it can unavoidably get things that happen that way, but like, if you again focus on what you can control in your situation, I think helps.
How were your kids during it all? And did they see you guys become friends? Was that...
They saw us probably both at our worst, and they did see us become friends. In fact, I think my one daughter said to her sister, when she heard us having a civil conversation, "Can you believe that? Like, listen, they're actually having a civil conversation." They're actually talking to each other. What? They were so shocked, Yeah. But I know, like, now they're adults and they have their own children.
Yeah.
And my son has gone through a divorce, and it broke his heart. And my daughter is married, and like, when you live with someone, you're annoyed. And 50% of the time, I don't know. Anyway, she, because of my divorce, and her husband's family his parents were divorced, they are really consciously trying to work things out all the times, because they don't want to do that to their children.
No.
But I really think that my children came out well adjusted, and I remember one of my kids saying to me, their friends' parents one of their friends' parents were getting a divorce, and the mom was going into the city to go to a nightclub or go to a bar or something, and one of my kids said to me, "Mom, is that what you're going to do now? Like, are you going to go play the single scene and go to town and go?" No, I'm just going to be here being your mom.
That's life.
That's my role now. It's not going to change. But so, I'm sure they had their little fears and things, but, they're all pretty well adjusted and they don't seem to have too many bad memories. I mean, once in a while they'll say, remember when this happened, Mom? Or, remember when you and Dad, whatever. But for the most part, I think, when we first told them, it was, oh no, and they were sad and they were crying. They were young.
Yeah.
I think they were grade 6, grade 7, and grade 9, about that age. And there's also, just from our community, there was probably some stigma attached, to being a divorced family. But I think they handled it well. I like to think in the end, like I handled it well and just let them be. And they always had access to their dad when they wanted.
And you mentioned before the cameras were on that you always spoke positively around them.
Usually. There might have been,
Let's be real here.
There might have been an odd thing I shared.
Yeah.
Like, I just thought they need to know that he's not paying child support. So that's why I can't buy you X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And,
the reality.
And if that's bad-mouthing him, well, so be it. He made that choice to not want to pay child support.
Yeah.
So, but for the most part, I had been told, don't bad-mouth your ex because the kids take that on themselves and think that that's how you feel about them. I'm not quite sure how that works out, why, but I was told that, try not to badmouth your ex. And so for the most part, I think that helps the kids. But it really helped when they saw we were, oh, wow, Mom and Dad are actually talking to each other.
Yeah, I bet you that was really healing for them.
Yeah.
But also I think it, when you don't badmouth your spouse, your ex-spouse, that's their parent, I think there's a level of trust that they have in the parent that doesn't badmouth their other parent, because that they know that their love for the other parent is still safe with you. And I think that's really, really important. I think that's really, really important for a child to know that they can go to their dads or their moms and come back and say, this is what we did, this is what we had. And then, their parents saying, oh, that's good. I'm glad you got to spend time with your dad. I'm glad you got to do this with your dad. Because that is separate from your relationship with your ex.
It's showing it to them that it's acceptable. That it's what I've mentioned to my kids a lot is love is a neat thing. You always have room for everyone, right? Like you have room to love your mom, you have room to love me.
Yeah.
And I don't care that like.
And my love's not going to change because
I want you to love your mom.
Yes.
I want you to have that time. And it's like you do with your kids and stuff. And that's like, it's important.
Yes.
For them to recognize that.
Yes.
Not feel like they're that they're hurting you by loving the other.
That's right.
It's kind of, I think that's important because otherwise they get torn.
Oh, and then they don't open up to you. Yeah. And because it's not safe. And the thought for me of my children not feeling safe talking to me is just too much. I want them to be like, oh, we did this at Dad's. And sometimes I ask too many questions, like, hey, what'd you do? Da-da-da, Mom. It's not because I'm prying, it's because I just want that communication line open and let them know that it's okay. Yeah. It's okay. You can have fun with your dad. You can love your dad. He's your dad. Just so, I'm glad that you said that you did that with your kids. And again, I'm not perfect either. I'm not standing on a pedestal. But it's an effort that I constantly strive for, is to always, keep that relationship separate and help them feel safe.
Yes, it's not easy. Sometimes, you want to let them know how bad you were hurt or what rotten thing they did,
or there's some times where you're like, okay, you have to say that this behavior was not okay. Because you're teaching your children correct behavior
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So there's times where I've said that this behavior is not okay. And I hope that when you have a spouse someday, that you never
Yeah.
act like that or talk like that or whatever, that you treat your spouse with respect, you treat your children with respect, like, and make sure that you teach correct behavior.
So I have another question as far as, because you mentioned, like it's hard because you're telling the kids, okay, well, I need to tell them, dad's not paying child support because of, this is what, and these are the repercussions of that. It makes me think about, because we're trying to forgive, we're trying to be, good in that way, but it's a battle, it's an uphill battle because we're in the thick of it and we're always doing the things. We're always getting thrown another curveball or whatever, so like, I guess for me, it's like, I'm thinking about all the things like you're getting up that hill, but then it's like another boulder comes down. You're like, because something else, because you're in it, right? Yeah. And so something else is like, oh, now I'm like, push down again and whatever. And so my question is like, just for your experience, how did you get over those hurdles every time? Like I'm guessing that there were, as you went through it to get.
Well, I would still be angry, upset. This isn't fair.
Yeah.
He makes a lot of money, but he's able to show he doesn't make hardly any money. And so and I don't know, I guess it's like anything in life. I guess you just have to put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
And just keep going and I guess have faith in every footstep and just, that somehow you'll be taken care of. My family, my parents were great help, and they were there and supported my kids and were helpful. And so, yeah, they're, along the way, even as the kids were older, there were still things that would happen because of they're getting married. And then there were those issues and disagreements between the ex and the new wife and me. And, there was, I guess it never ends until they end.
Yeah.
And now he's gone and it's, it's what was. So, but yeah, I don't know how you just keep going and hope for better days ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you feel like it improved over time though? Like
for sure. Yeah. Because a lot of those things resolved themselves too.
Yeah.
The longer I taught, then I had a better income, and then I was able to cope financially better without needing as much help. And so then I could say, it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
just keep your money. And,
Yeah.
there wasn't that same issue so I didn't care about the unfairness when I was not trying to put gas in the car.
Yeah.
It sounds like you didn't let it make you bitter. You just
Yeah.
just made the mess.
I don't know that it was a conscious thought process of consciously thinking, well, I'm not going to be bitter. I just always believe that our problems and our trials can make us bitter or better. But I don't know if it was a conscious decision to be better and not bitter. But I don't.
I kind of think that sometimes that's a personality trait.
Maybe.
Sometimes that comes easier to others than others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so too. Yes.
Yeah, because I feel like, if people knew some of the things that I went through and some of the things that Drew went through and whatever, I'm sure they'd be like, oh, that's so unfair. How are you happy?
How are you still smiling?
How are you still smiling? And I think a lot of it is just being grateful for where you are, being grateful for the everyday. I have my kids. I have time that I can spend with them. I have, when I divorced, I lived in this tiny little apartment and he lived in this beautiful house, and that could have been unfair. But you know what? It wasn't. I was like, I'm going to take this time to develop my relationship, develop myself, to move forward, to try and forgive. There's so many positives that you can take from amongst the trials, the unfairness, and all those things. But if you focus on the unfairness, it's hard to move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good place to end,
Sure.
because it's just like dealing with everything,
Yeah.
trying to make the most out of our trials, and
And gratitude.
Gratitude.
Attitude of gratitude for what you have, the good. It looks at the good,
Yep.
because there's both. And
Yep.
whatever you focus on is what you'll see.
That's exactly it. Like, think of those trials as opportunities. Opportunities to move forward, opportunities to develop yourself, opportunities to create good relationships.
100%.
Awesome.
So yeah, so if anybody does want to reach out, talk about experiences that might have connected with them, would that be okay for them to reach
They
out to
could
you? Or,
reach out to me on Messenger,
yeah,
through Facebook, right?
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things that were said today that could help other people, because we're all going through something, whether it's a divorce, whether it's a death, whether it's
A wayward child.
unfairness. There's the same principles. There's very similar principles in all of that. In setting boundaries, giving yourself space for grace, and creating opportunities with gratitude. This has been another episode of What Matters Most, and thank you, Diana, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome.